This is probably the most sacred place, the closest anyone can get to the spirituality of St. Francis, this stone that's here that everyone wants to touch, wants to get close to. It was placed in the exact spot where the Franciscans tell us that St. Francis lived his great moment with Jesus Christ, the spiritual moment when he is said to have received the stigmata, when he received the wounds of the same wounds as Jesus, coming from something spiritual, from a spiritual moment, but that turned into real wounds.
While he was in meditation, he saw a seraph with 6 shining wings descend from heaven, flying quickly toward him. As it got closer, he could clearly see the figure of a crucified man in the middle of the wings. This seraph with the image of Christ hovered before him. The vision caused him immense astonishment, but it also filled him with joy, while at the same time his heart was seized by a bitter pain. It was right here, in the mountains of the Italian region of Tuscany, that St. Francis experienced his epiphany, his great moment of encounter with Christ, who appeared to him crucified in the form of a seraph, symbolizing the union of a burning love, represented by the fiery wings, with the redeeming suffering, which was the crucifixion of Jesus. When the vision disappeared, a flame of inextinguishable love remained lit in his soul. And at the same time, the marks of the wounds of the crucified Christ appeared on his flesh. His hands and feet seemed to be pierced by nails, with the heads visible on the inside and the tips bent outward. On the right side of his body there was an open wound like the one that was inflicted on Christ by the spear, from which blood often flowed, staining his tunic. And the account of Saint Bonaventure, the first biographer of Saint Francis, continues with a very powerful testimony. Speaking of St. Francis as the living reflection of Christ, his very imitation in the best sense of that idea. Thus, adorned with the stigmata of the crucified one, St. Francis became a living image of the Lord, as if he were hanging on the cross. He bore these marks with humility until the end of his life, carefully hiding them but allowing them to be seen by those closest to him when necessary to glorify God. I wanted to invite you to take this journey with me, shall we? On foot, by car, whatever way is necessary, so we can visit each of the sacred places where St. Francis went, where he lived some of the most important moments of his life, including his conversion and his communication with the divine. I want you to really come with me to all these places so we can get as close as possible to what the life of this great saint was like, who today has this immense basilica dedicated to him. So are you enjoying this video? Let me invite you now. Come study with me in the course Jesus, the Light of History, so you can understand every detail of the life of the Master of Nazareth. All you have to do is go to rodrigoalvarez.site, or even easier, click the link in the description of this video and you'll go straight there. In the course Jesus, the Light of History, I guide you through an in-depth investigation into the life of Jesus, also supported by my travels that you've been following here on Infinite Journey. The course is completely online. You can take it at your own pace with no complications. Just click the link in the description and I'll see you in the classroom. Now let's get back to our video here. Francis also went on pilgrimages like the ones thousands of people make here in Assisi every year. That's right, he was above all an example. He made a pilgrimage to Rome, wanting to feel closer to the apostles Peter and Paul, who are believed to have spent their last years there. The wealthy young man was deeply restless. How was it possible to have so much privilege when the rest of the people had almost nothing? Francis decided to live that experience of poverty and simplicity himself, because only then could he understand the suffering of others. He wanted to spend some time among beggars and panhandlers to, in a way, learn how to be a saint. But it was well before that, in 1206, right after a youth of excess, a truly worldly life, that young man, born as Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone, who was only later renamed Francesco, publicly renounced everything he had, including his inheritance from his father, who was a wealthy cloth merchant here in this region. It was in front of the people of Assisi, with everyone watching, that St. Francis gave up everything and left it all behind. It is said that he even took off the very clothes he was wearing, keeping only the bare minimum, because he wanted to follow and experience for himself the example of charity set by Jesus. We have to understand the meaning of this gesture. Besides obviously having a real concrete meaning of giving up material possessions, it was also a way for Francis to connect with the divine. A radical gesture, it's true, leaving everything you have behind, even your own clothes. But many times that's exactly how things happen. You give up something to start over. Or even, in his case differently, to go back to the past, to return to what he understood had been the life of Jesus Christ. Knowing this story, it's not hard for us to understand why the writer Dante Alighieri said that Francis was a light that shone upon the world. And even more, other scholars said that he would be the greatest figure in Christianity after Jesus. That makes a lot of sense. Saint Francis was celebrated even during his lifetime and canonized shortly after his death. And even though he lived more than 800 years ago, we have a lot of information about what he did, thought, and preached. Not all the darkness in the world can extinguish the light of a single candle. It's no use going out to preach if the way you live isn't already the preaching. While proclaiming peace with your lips, be even more careful to have it fully in your heart. The words of St. Francis were always this powerful. They demanded honesty, frankness, and dedication from everyone. It's interesting that even though it happened 800 years ago, before the invention of the printing press, we have many accounts of what was said by St. Francis himself and also written by him. Friends wrote about the saint, and then soon after, his biographer Giovanni di Fidanza, later known as Saint Bonaventure, told us much of what we know today. Francis lived at the turn from the 12th century to the 13th, and from that time until now, despite many wars and technological revolutions, little has changed in these landscapes. The region that is now in the Italian province of Perugia still has the stone buildings and much of the natural beauty that served as the backdrop for the saint's life. I came to this place here, to these little steps, this descent, to invite you to go back in time with me. Shall we go back to the 12th century? At the end of the 12th century, Pietro di Bernardone and his wife, Pica Bourlemont, a woman of French origin, lived here. Well, today here by my side I have a sign that says Via Pietro di Bernardone. Because this little path here goes through the land of the family that lived here, where a church was built right next to it, which I'll show you in a moment, and that used to be the family's house. All of this used to be part of the house where the boy Giovanni was born. The year might have been 1181, maybe 1182, we're not sure. What matters is that at that moment, in this place, the boy was born who would make his mark on that era. Actually, not just that era, but all of Christianity that would come after him. Now, if I just said that a Giovanni was born in this house, why isn't there a Saint Giovanni of Assisi or Saint John of Assisi today? Well, that's because Pietro, his father, was a cloth merchant and was traveling at the time the boy was born. So what did his mother do? She chose the name Giovanni, which means young in Italian. But then his father came back home and said something like, "That wasn't the name I wanted for him." He changed the name, which suddenly became Francesco, Francis. Francis had everything anyone could want in terms of material possessions in this house. Everything, everything, everything. He had wealth, his father was important, but something was missing. And it's not that it was really missing. Actually, he had it in excess. And reflecting, meditating, the young Francis, after seeing all those excesses, realized that what was missing in life was a purpose. And he only discovered this purpose when he came into contact for the first time with poverty. There, where everything was missing, there was something that Francis didn't have inside him. But the conversion process of St. Francis was not like what happened, for example, with St. Paul. Suddenly, a vision in the desert on the road to Damascus. A vision that marked the life of St. Paul. No, for St. Francis, everything was very slow. It was a process of maturation that he needed to experience for some time until he was sure he wanted to convert and dedicate his whole life to what we understand today as being a Franciscan, as giving up everything a person can have to devote themselves to others. It's Jesus' love for others taken to the fullest, taken to a level that we've rarely seen in the history of humanity. And that's why this saint, represented in so many ways here in Assisi, right here next to us in a beautiful clay sculpture, but in so many others, that's why he is considered one of the greatest saints in the history of Christianity. So, are you enjoying this video? So let me invite you, come study with me in the course Mary, the story of the Mother of Jesus. It's an immersive course with 15 lessons and over 7 hours of learning. We start with the birth of Mary, follow her up to the moment of her death, and then embark on a 2,000-year journey of many religious discussions and the entire expansion of devotion to Our Lady. If you want to start studying with me right now, go to rodrigoalvarez.site, or to make it easier, just click the link below in the video description. Oh, and I almost forgot, we make more than 20 visits to sacred places from Paris to Jerusalem. The link is in the description. Just click there and I'll wait for you in the classroom. Let's get back to watching our video now. After being imprisoned for almost a year during a war between his city of Assisi and what at the time was the neighboring city of Perugia, Francis returned home with health problems, and during his recovery, he had his first moment of contemplation of nature. A relationship that would be fundamental in his journey. Even so, without finding a purpose in his futile life, he thought about joining the Crusades, but ended up giving up. This church here has a very special meaning because it was built exactly where Francis's father's house used to be. The father who was very rich, from whom Francis needed in a way to free himself in order to convert. It's no coincidence the church was dedicated to St. Francis's conversion. There is a very symbolic place here in the church, which is a little corner. We imagine it was a corner of the house where Francis was or used to be locked up by his father. It's a very striking, very powerful scene, but it shows what was going on inside him. He needed to free himself from his family, to free himself from all that attachment to material possessions that came from his father, in order to be who he wanted to be, an imitation of the life of Jesus Christ. It was not by chance that St. Francis became perhaps the most important saint in history after the apostles, one of the most important in all of Christian history. The words that came out of his mouth no longer made sense to his parents or to the Bishop of Assisi. Francis sounded incoherent and his plans seemed impossible. Loneliness came, and here in the church of San Damiano, or Saint Damien, he would come to take refuge. It was a very simple place with little decoration, and the structure was in very poor condition. One day, while praying inside here, Francis said that he communicated with Jesus through a crucifix that was on the wooden altar. Jesus is said to have asked him to restore the church. But was he really meant to restore the little church of San Damiano? Or was Jesus talking about the entire congregation? After that, Francis decided to give away everything he had. Money, clothes. He opened the closets at home, took out all the clothes he had inside, sheets, everything he could, and went out looking to sell these things. He even took his horse. He went to a neighbor's house and managed to sell everything. And well, before we find out what will happen, it's important to remember that St. Francis was inspired by a passage from the Gospel of Matthew, the church. Jesus said to him, "If you want to be perfect, go, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Do not carry gold, silver, or copper in your belts." Francis wanted to isolate himself from the world and ended up coming here, to the Eremo delle Carceri, today renamed as the Hermitage of St. Francis. At that time, it was the Hermitage of a prison. I'm walking here through these dark areas with so much fog, and suddenly I see glimpses of light. That's what St. Francis was talking about. And I keep thinking about how much of his thinking also developed here in this place where he came to meditate. Walking through this hermitage here, very close to Assisi where we are, but in another way we're also very far away, very isolated from everything. I remember that Jesus, when he wanted to meditate, went to the desert, to a place we believe it was, Jericho, where in fact today there is a monastery dedicated to that moment. On the Mount of Temptation, where Jesus, as the Gospels tell, was tempted by the devil, I keep wondering what kind of meditation St. Francis might have done in these caves of the Hermitage. How important it is for us to be able to stop, to forget that the world exists, to forget that everything exists for a while, just to think about what's inside us, to better understand what makes us wake up in the morning, leave the house, and want to live. It must have been a very profound moment, and it certainly was, because it caused a great transformation in St. Francis. I'll keep going down here. Everything is very tiny, very narrow. The Franciscan tradition tells us that this very secluded place here in the Hermitage was where he slept. Fitting for a saint who preached humility and slept on the stone. Is it tradition? Did it really happen? Knowing who St. Francis was, it's quite likely. And the tradition goes even further, telling us something mysterious, perhaps supernatural or simply physical. Here, this deeper part in this little corner here would be the mark of St. Francis's face while he slept here in the Hermitage. It was here in the Hermitage that St. Francis lived through one of the most remarkable moments of his life. A moment that still makes us remember him vividly and feel close to him today. Because it was when St. Francis walked towards some birds, and instead of flying away, the birds came toward him. This showed not only St. Francis's affection for the animals, but also the animals' affection for St. Francis. Those who lived at that time spoke of St. Francis's closeness to nature. And you can tell, right? He always sought out places that were close to forests, where there were birds, where there were other animals. It's no coincidence that even today St. Francis is depicted among animals and in the midst of nature. In fact, he wrote a lot about this. Is he the saint of birds? Is he the saint of nature? Maybe we can say that he was an environmentalist saint long before we realized the importance of preserving our planet. From what we've been told, it was also here in the Hermitage that St. Francis met with Jesus once again. This time, he received a request to spread his message to care for the sick and anyone else in need. That's how Francis began his public preaching, but still without formal authorization from the Vatican. More and more people wanted to hear him, and Francis became afraid. He didn't want the same fate as Peter Waldo and his order of the Waldensians, who a few decades earlier had done something similar and were declared heretics. So, to avoid problems, Francis went to Rome and asked Pope Innocent III for approval to create a new order. Pope Innocent III didn't accept it right away, no. It's said that he hesitated a lot and only changed his mind after a dream. In this dream, it's said that Pope Innocent saw the Church of St. John Lateran collapsing, being completely destroyed. Until suddenly a very poor, simple, humble man appeared there and helped him rebuild that church. It was exactly the request that St. Francis said Jesus Christ made to him in an apparition. And then Pope Innocent changed his mind and granted permission for the Franciscan order to finally be established. The authorization was given verbally. Interesting, isn't it? Nothing had to be written. This authorization came on April 16, 1210, and is considered the foundation of the Franciscan order. It was shortly after that he became very close to St. Clare, a girl from a wealthy family who decided to follow in Francis's footsteps despite her family's protests. When another young woman wanted to join the group, Francis decided that it was necessary to create an order just for women. That girl would become known as St. Clare of Assisi. After receiving the Pope's authorization, St. Francis decided to travel the world. He went to France, Spain, the Holy Land, and also to Egypt. And at that time it is said that a tradition began, or at least a strong belief, that St. Francis worked miracles. He was seen as a miracle worker in his lifetime. People wanted to touch St. Francis just as people wanted to touch Jesus, as the Gospels tell us. And then the devotion to St. Francis started to grow and grow, and he became the immensely important saint we know today. St. Francis was already a much older man, already an elderly man. He suffered from illness. He had a serious problem with his eyes. And he asked to go up to the top of a mountain, Mount Laverna, which is this very mountain I'm standing on, because he wanted to meditate. Now you have to imagine this mountain here without any of these buildings that you see. On this side we can see it was all mountain and forest, just like it still is behind me. St. Francis came here and stayed on top of a rock, and in a great moment of meditation he had what he told everyone was his encounter with a seraph that represented Jesus. This is the corridor that leads to the chapel of the Stigmata, the most important place in this sanctuary. And along the way we see some very important scenes from the life of St. Francis. Here, for example, St. Francis is listening to the voice of Jesus, who speaks to him in San Damiano, where we were just a little while ago. In this other fresco, St. Francis embraces Christ, who appears in the form of a leper. And here is a very important moment, we've also talked about this, when St. Francis renounces his riches, including his clothes, to start a new life as St. Francis of Assisi. At that moment, he was not yet considered a saint, but he was already beginning his holy life. In this other image, we see the beginning of the Franciscan order. Look at what a beautiful scene this is. On top of a mountain, just like this one where we are here in Laverna, St. Francis and his first followers, the first friars of the congregation, which would later become known as the Franciscan order.
This is probably the most sacred place, the closest anyone can get to all the spirituality of St. Francis. This stone here, which everyone wants to touch, wants to get close to, foi colocada no lugar exato onde os franciscanos nos contam que São Francisco viveu o seu grande momento com Jesus Cristo, momento espiritual. em que ele teria recebido os estigmatas, quando he received the same wounds as Jesus, arising from a spiritual experience but becoming real wounds. This was fundamental in the history and life of St. Francis, and later, in the place where there was a forest, this chapel was built so that this moment could be remembered. This was more than 800 years ago.
As we walk here through Assisi, all the time we see in the streets, in the little shops, what looks like a cross, but it's a different cross because it's a cross that doesn't have the top part of the shaft. And a lot of people keep wondering what this is after all. Do they use a different cross here? Or is it not a cross? I'm going to go into this little shop here, which has many different ones, made of olive wood, very beautiful, to explain this better. They have many different kinds. And some you'll see even have the image of Jesus Christ.
Na letra tal, bom, eu já entreguei, né? É a letra grega tal, que foi muito importante para São Francisco, no ensinamento de São Francisco. Em outros lugares aqui, a gente encontra também da maneira mais simples possível, que é essa que é toda feita em madeira de oliveira, daqui da região. A gente vê muitas oliveiras aqui em Assis por toda parte. E é simples desse jeito, madeira, como tudo de São Francisco, na verdade, era simples. E São Francisco viu nessa letra uma série de simbolismos. Primeiro, já uma referência que está no Antigo Testamento, que ele mencionava, que está no livro de Ezequiel, que diz o seguinte: o Senhor disse, passa no meio da cidade, no meio de Jerusalém, e marca com uma tal
On the foreheads of the men who groan and cry. Saint Francis understood that this was a symbol of healing, a symbol of acceptance. And so it happened several times throughout his life. And over time, this letter also began to take the shape of the cross itself, which Saint Francis himself said it would have been like this before Pilate and his men placed the other part on top with the words, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, which was in fact his sentence, the accusation of being the King of the Jews, the guilt they placed on him for the crime of rebellion against Roman authority. Below this, there was no such accusation. It's all very symbolic, and it's no coincidence that this symbol has endured over time for more than 800 years now.
"800 years since his death, and in Italy there will be great celebrations because Saint Francis is the patron saint of Italy, the protector of Italy."
What does the canticle say?
The Canticle of the Creatures is the most beautiful poem in the world, and he wrote it, as I was saying, 800 years ago, and it talks about the world in general, about nature, because Francis loved nature. He called everything brother or sister, brother sun, sister moon, brother wind, brother fire. Is still written in the original vernacular Latin, you know. See, if you look at each sentence, there's the symbol it refers to. This one, see, is the sun, and it starts like this. Most High, Almighty, good Lord, yours are the praises and the glory, the honor and all blessings. It's a wonderful poem. It's known all over the world.
Story of the wolf.
A wolf in Gubbio, which tradition says was a bad wolf. He went and managed to make it gentle, and it was always with him. It walked around the town. It became the symbol of Gubbio, and the story is very famous, the Wolf of Gubbio. So this is called the Crucifix of San Damiano. This is the cross that spoke to Saint Francis. Everything started from this crucifix. The story of Francis and the story of Assisi.
Hey animal, I'm here.
See? I'm a friend of Francesco.
You saw we were here talking about St. Francis and a little animal already showed up here, but he's angry.
I told you this cross from this crucifix started Francesco's conversion.
At San Damiano.
At San Damiano. Originally, it was in the church of San Damiano. This cross said to Francesco, "Go and repair my house." Now, the original is displayed in the Basilica of St. Clare, because I don't know if you know that St. Clare lived in the church of San Damiano, and there she founded the Order of the Poor Clares. And when she died, they built the Basilica of St. Clare here in Assisi, inside the historic center in her honor, and they brought it there. Now at San Damiano, there is a copy.
I want to remember the boy who was born in Bethlehem and see with my own eyes the suffering he faced out of love for us. St. Francis wanted people to relive the moment of Jesus' birth. He really wanted people to feel transported to the manger, which the Gospels tell us was in Bethlehem, where the birth of the baby Jesus took place. And, as he said, see with their own eyes and really feel what happened in that very sacred moment. And this story began in 1223 in a city not far from here called Greccio, where St. Francis decided to invite some people from the community to stage a nativity scene. So this one we're seeing here is very similar to what he did back then, a little simpler, it's true. He invited a person to be Mary, a man to be Joseph. He brought a little ox and a donkey in reference to the prophecy of Isaiah. I'll talk about that in a moment. And who was baby Jesus? They couldn't use a real baby, so they used a rag doll instead. So the first nativity scene was a live one. It was staged inside a cave in Greccio, which became known after that as the New Bethlehem. And then I think it's important to highlight the reference that St. Francis makes to Isaiah's prophecy with the little ox and the donkey, which is very symbolic, because we know that Isaiah was seen by the evangelists and the apostles as a prophet who already spoke about the life of Jesus. The ox knows its owner and the donkey its master's manger. But Israel has no knowledge my people do not understand. And of course, everywhere we go, here in Assisi, in all the churches, in the house where St. Francis lived with his parents, everywhere, we see different nativity scenes, each more beautiful than the last with some different details. Some emphasizing the presence of the Magi, who we know were not kings, nor were there three of them, because that was something tradition brought later. But they were Magi from the east, who came following the star from the east, as the Gospels tell us, which led the Magi to arrive at the manger where Mary was with Jesus and Joseph. There are several traditions about this birth, and I have already talked about some of them in other specials. But the important thing here is to understand that St. Francis brought the nativity scene into the Christian tradition, and the nativity scene became part of Christmas starting with St. Francis. And all these beautiful images that we see around the world, not just here in Assisi, represent St. Francis's desire for Christians to relive the experience of the birth of Jesus. St. Francis died in 1226, and I want you to imagine with me the emotion that filled this whole place. Well, first, Pope Gregory, who was his friend, came for the ceremony, of course. But the entire population, including people from other nearby regions, came here not only to attend the funeral ceremonies, but also to try to get some relics. Not just any relics, but first-class relics from the body of St. Francis. People tried to get pieces of hair, pieces of nails. It was a big commotion, but after the situation was brought under control, the funeral took place normally, and 2 years later, St. Francis was canonized. I visited many churches around the world, including churches built into rocks, tiny churches, and ones tucked away in narrow alleys. or ones that were built over time, like the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which started as a hermitage and then a basilica was built around the hermitage. But I had never seen a basilica like this one here. It has the lower church, the one that's underneath, and the upper church, which is on this other floor here. They are two churches together, one on top of the other. This building was constructed right after the death of Saint Francis. We can also understand the importance of the saint.
Quando a gente percebe que
The moment he died, the world mobilized to preserve his memory, to honor his life, and, well, to make sure he would be remembered for many, many centuries. We're now talking about 800 years after his death, and this sanctuary is still crowded. It's one of the most interesting basilicas I've ever visited because first, it's very complex. It's a huge space.
There's
A lot of
chapels.
There is one dedicated to Saint Anthony of Padua and another dedicated to Saint Mary Magdalene. It's a place for gathering. People come here to visit. They want to feel close to Saint Francis. Of course, there are also masses. Many frescoes by Giotto, a great painter depicting the life of Saint Francis. In a way, just as I had that impression outside, it also reminds me a bit of the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre of Jesus in Jerusalem with all its complexity and all its importance. One of the most sacred basilicas in the world. Now, a very important moment of the visit is about to happen. I'm going down to the crypt to take you to the tomb of Saint Francis.
Here in the crypt of the Basilica, we
Can
visit
the tomb
of Saint Francis. Everything is simple, just like his life. Although the place is large and grand in its architectural aspect, everything is made of stone and iron.
The Franciscan order gained so much prestige that it was entrusted with the custody of the holy places that are under the control of the Vatican in the Holy Land. The first Franciscans went there in the 13th century. The influence of St. Francis is enormous all over the world. His name is part of the name of one of the largest and most beautiful cities in the United States, where, by the way, I lived for a while. And one of the largest rivers in Brazil, the São Francisco River, which is one of the most important sources of water in our country, supplying at least 16 million people. That's really St. Francis. Despite all this importance and influence on the course of the Catholic faith, it was only in 2013 that a pope chose the name Francis for the first time. Was it because of the weight that this name carries that the others didn't take the risk? Or was it because other popes weren't willing to be as humble and detached as Francis? With so much history to tell, I almost forgot to talk about the habit that the Franciscans wear, which also strongly evokes St. Francis and his message. First, it's as simple as possible, that brown habit. And then that little cord here is also very simple, right? And it has 3 knots. And those knots represent chastity, obedience, and poverty. All related to the idea of simplicity, of humility that defined the life of St. Francis. Saint of the poor, patron of animals, birds, and the environment. Some say that he was also one of the thinkers who gave rise to the ideas that flourished in the Renaissance. The immense legacy of this great saint appears in the simplicity of his prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. It is in giving that we receive, in forgiving that we are forgiven, in dying that we are born to eternal life.